We're lay people. We have an identity in God for sure. But even so, our primary calling doesn't have to be politics to be politically engaged. And we have this dual identity, as 1 Peter 2 describes it, this wonderful identity that nonetheless sees us living here as strangers, as foreigners on earth, because we have a higher citizenship. But where we are, we have an enormous power to impact change. And so it is for us to do more than nothing. And so looking not just at how should we vote in this upcoming general election, July 4th, 2024, but looking more generally as citizens of the kingdom, how do we engage as citizens of whatever country we happen to be in, whatever municipality, whoever our candidate is, how should we approach the issues and how should we engage politically? So I'm going to start with a few things that I noticed, a few things that came to mind, and a few that I wrote in commentaries, which I thought would be useful to highlight. Then I'll go into 2 readings, which have a lot to say about this. Fairly short readings, both of them, but nonetheless very powerful. And then I'll acknowledge the fact that it's not easy to engage, coming down from that mountaintop, so to speak, to the valley, especially in the midst of a full schedule and whatever other challenges you so happen to be facing, to be engaged, to do the hard work of engaging in a field which may not be something you like or gravitate to. It is difficult, but nonetheless, we're called to do it. Well, at least so I believe. This talk is not meant to convince anyone that we have a duty to vote. That's not my job at all. That's what God is for. That's what conviction is for, and you should vote according to your conviction. But as I'll say, if you're voting by conscience, you better make sure your conscience is well informed. And so I'll talk a little about how to choose how to conduct ourselves afterwards, and finish off with some suggested points for prayer and for action. And so to start with a few observations, first of all, the institutions of authority given to us are offices, not necessarily about the occupant of those offices. And so it's important to recognize that we in the UK live in a democracy, a flawed democracy with many issues, many issues, but nonetheless in democracy, 1 person, 1 vote being the idea, with only many exceptions. But nonetheless, when you look at the political slate and you think these are the candidates we're being asked to vote for, remember that we've been given not just authorities in the form of the people who occupy offices, but the offices of authority themselves. In other words, it's not just, Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer who you might be voting for. What we're also to take into account is that it's the institution, the political establishment itself, the institutions that govern civic life. Those are God-given, even if those occupying them may not recognize or respect God as they should. And so to give an extract from that passage we'll look more into later. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. And especially when we're reading works which have been translated from a different language, I think we should be careful of getting hung up on a single word. But again, looking at the idea of offices and not occupants, is what God has instituted, the authority itself, not necessarily those people occupying those offices. And this is a passage I've often struggled with over the years, especially looking at a range of behavior from incompetence to idiocy to malice to sheer corruption, and people who have used their office and abused it as a place for dog whistling, for inciting violence, people who have compromised every view and belief they may really stand for in order to hold on to power. But nonetheless, those who corrupt good things are as human as the rest of us. All of us, it says in Romans 3:23, have fallen short of the glory of God. And if we're looking for perfect candidates, then we're going to spend a lifetime looking, and that without success. And so it's important to respect the fact that even though those who occupy offices may not be those we would wish for, the offices themselves are God-given, and we should respect those offices. And one observation that came to mind when preparing for this is that it should be no surprise, this passage, even though it's hard to accept, when we look at the range of different forms of government and people in government, not just in the UK, but around the world, that authority is from God, because all good things are from God. And authority, that is the power to will and to act, is a good thing. It can be used for great good, and when it's used at its best, it can protect a great number of people and help lift people anyway into better circumstances and protect them from those who would wish to harm them. And if I can just get to the next slide somehow. Perfect. Okay. Now, one story that came to mind when I was preparing for this was from Matthew chapter 8, actually, how being under authority gives us power. And I'll read the parable and then talk about it, or I'm sorry, read the excerpt and then talk about it a little. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, the centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home, paralyzed, suffering terribly. Jesus said to him, shall I come and heal him? The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go, let it be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. Now, as people living in a democracy, as people living under government, we have certain rights as a consequence of that. We have the right to vote. We have the right to petition our officers, our MPs, and we have the right to engage in the political system in a way that others outside the UK may not. We can protest and we can ballot. We can hold hustings. We can do all these things because we are under the authority of a prime minister and of local members of parliament and of our local councils indeed. And because of these things, we do have a certain power to engage in the system. So even if those serving us may seem to be perfect examples of incompetence, we should never, even just to ourselves, despair or disdain the process or make the mistake of disengaging entirely. For when you disengage, you create a vacuum, you create a space for those who do wish to abuse the officers to do so without the checks and balances that come from an engaged civil community. And so being under authority, we have that power. And more profoundly, as we'll see in the reading from 1 Peter chapter 2, we're under a different authority, a much higher authority, which gives us a much greater power. It says in Ephesians chapter 1 that the very power that raised Christ from the dead is available to us. And if we're under this authority, should we fear or disdain or despair at so small an institution as politics? Now, another thing that occurred to me preparing for this is that a lot of the Bible is written to or written about people living under alien authorities or living in strange lands. Abram, when he is still called Abram and not Abraham, was not living in a land of his own. You know, Joseph had great success in Egypt, but nonetheless it was not his land. Even after being brought out of slavery, when Moses was leading the people of Israel, they wandered in the desert for 40 years. And after being blessed greatly by God and abusing these blessings and giving into foreign gods, the people of Israel found themselves time and time again in exile and living in humiliation as a result of their disobedience. And this isn't to bash them any more than I'd bash any of us for making mistakes. But one of the points is that if you truly engage in the word, if you are reading and engaging in the Bible, you already have a great deal of access to the question, what should we do when we're living in an imperfect place? What should we do when we're not living in the kingdom which is to come? You know, this is an imperfect world, an imperfect country, but nonetheless, we have a great deal of practical advice, you know, contained within the Bible on how to behave in these situations. So to pick one from Jeremiah chapter 29, and interestingly, Jeremiah was writing this, you know, the fun thing about prophets is they tend to see the future, or rather they tend to receive from God a word of the future. And so Jeremiah was able to write words of hope even before his people were carried into exile, when God told him to tell the people, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you in exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. So this is as firm as any an indictment that we shouldn't give up on the places that we're in. The book of Daniel is an excellent example of this as well. Again, a prophet, one who lived closely with God, but one who lived very closely with God in the state of Babylon. You know, the state so evil and immoral in the book of Revelation, Babylon is cited as a kingdom which represents all evil. And in Jesus' day, and in the day of the early church, they were living under Roman occupation. That's how Jesus was able to say when, you know, questioned by those who wanted to trap him, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And so in all of these, and especially in Jesus, we have a great example of what to do as we live under occupation, or as we live in a place which is not the place to come. And so let's read Romans chapter 13, 1-7. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only for possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. And so a few observations on this passage, and I'll actually begin from the second half of it previously. Now, if you don't pay tax, you better start paying taxes, first of all. Second of all, what this passage is describing is not necessarily how rulers do behave, but how they should, how those to whom God has given responsibility and authority are supposed to conduct that authority, them, and to uphold God's order. That is, to reward what is good and to protect and safeguard the pursuit of all good things, and to punish what is bad, and namely, to protect those doing good from those doing bad. But we don't have the choice to live outside of this authority. Even if you find a place off the grid, entirely off the grid, with zero dependence on anyone, you still live under God. And I'm guessing for most of us, that's neither practical nor desirable to cut ourselves off entirely from society, from those around us. We don't have the choice to live outside of it. But we're told that the reason we're living inside of it is for our good. These rulers have been appointed for our good, even if they sometimes fail to uphold that. Political leaders also enjoy not just authority, but legitimacy. And they're only legitimate because they get this from God. All authority belongs to God ultimately, and that's why God is able to give it to those he pleases. And because of this, they have legitimacy. And crucially, legitimacy when it comes to the use of force. One of the defining characteristics of a state is having a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. That is, you have the right to do awful things if you really choose to, but the state has the right to punish you, even incorrectly, for what you do. And just in case you're thinking that this is naive of Paul or that he was unaware of how bad things could get, remember that he was writing under, or it's suspected that he was writing under the Roman Emperor Nero. One of the most likely dates given for the letter to the Romans is AD 57. One of the earliest dates is AD 47, but AD 57 is seen as a rough estimate. And Nero, if I'm correct, came to power in AD 54. And even if Paul was writing before Nero's persecution of the Christians, Nero had enough of the vices which Paul described in chapters 1 and 2 of this letter, that Paul had no illusions, or would have had no illusions about how Nero was behaving and who he was, and no illusions about the godliness of Nero, as it were. And so let's move on to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 to 17. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And so in no unclear terms, Peter is telling us, not just those he is writing to, but also us, that we're submitting not just for our sake, but for the Lord's sake. It's not for our own sake that we're submitting, but as an act of obedience to God. Whether we live or whether we die, it is to the Lord, as Paul writes in Romans 14. Whether we eat or whether we abstain from eating, it is to the Lord. May our decisions and the way we live be a living sacrifice and be a pleasing offering to God. We're freed from the old covenant and its demands that you have all these different types of sacrifices. It's not the blood of animals that can atone for sins, we're told, even in the Old Testament. So the prophet Micah, he's asking, shall I, sacrifice even my firstborn? Shall I give all I have to please God? And it's not that pleases God. There's no physical sacrifice we could make that would be sufficient to atone for what we have done or to make up for the incredible sacrifice that Jesus indeed took upon himself to give himself for us. And so as we live, we're to live to the Lord. And even here, we're told that it's not necessarily for us, but it's for God that we live this way. But one of the most wonderful things about the Bible, one of those things that if you've ever been in a position where you want to repay someone who's just too generous to be repaid fully, it's almost infuriating that there's no possible way that we can give enough to God. Even when we do stuff for God's sake, we find ourselves improved by it. And I find what Peter says about our identity most wonderful. We're a chosen people, a royal priesthood. And the way we can be priests is that all barriers between us and God have been removed through Jesus. So we're able to minister and to serve directly at the feet of God. And we're a holy nation. We may not have been a people before, but now we are the people of God. That is our citizenship and that is our kingdom. So even if we're foreigners and exiles here in these countries, even if, you were born here and you're raised here and you love this country and, you can practically smell its soil in your nostrils even now, this is not your true country. This is not your kingdom. We're living here as foreigners and exiles, and we have to abstain from all sinful desires which wage war against our soul. And that includes the tendency and the temptation to give up on other people, to give up on the political process, to wage the political process with underhanded tactics, to fall into an us versus them mentality. It's not against enemies of blood and flesh that we fight. Every human is undeserving, but we're equally undeserving, and every human is a brother and a sister to us. And so it's not for our sake that we're to do these things, but we are told to do them in acknowledgement of our identity as a royal priesthood, a chosen people, God's special possession and his holy nation. Now, this isn't to cover up or overlook the fact that it is really hard work to do anything worth doing, it seems. It's hard work to be responsible. It's much harder to be responsible than to do what you feel like. Preparing for this talk was quite difficult. I've not read a single manifesto yet. I know the names of the two leaders of the major political parties, but that's roughly it. I've not done the hard work of thinking through or planning who to vote for and why. And I caution not to feel a certain way or to give up or to allow yourself to indulge too much in disdain for those. I'm talking to myself as well, because I have had strong feelings about many of those in power and many of their decisions. But, we're to submit humbly to God. And also, we're not to deny the truth. We don't have enough time or even the expertise or the access to the innermost thoughts of those in power and those aspiring to power to know every party and every candidate inside out. What they write inside their manifestos aren't legally binding. They can write anything and do something different. Individual candidates may have strong convictions, but if they're ordered to vote along party lines, often these convictions will cave in the face of the alternative being made redundant. And I don't say this is a criticism necessarily. I think many of us, if we are told to do something or be fired, unfortunately, we would make the wrong decision. But nonetheless, much as we should pray for them to be people of conviction, we should be aware that voting for the candidate whose moral compass may align most strongly with yours might not guarantee that they would act as you would wish that they would. And in power, even a party who was perfect would have to respond to circumstances beyond their control. So we can't take anything that is written or said now as a guarantee of what is to come. All that's guaranteed is that we shouldn't worry about tomorrow, that we should commit all this to God. But there is hard work that we need to do. We're told not to worry. We're told to present everything to God by prayer and by petition, and that God's peace will guard our hearts and our minds in Jesus. And I think this guarding and this renewing, this transforming of the mind, as Paul writes in Romans 12, is essential during election season. And whenever we're in times of fractious debates and times where the media plays up even more than usual a tendency to try and win attention as opposed to promote truth. And we're not to worry about tomorrow. If you feel, I don't have time this evening to research, or it's too late for me right now. There's nothing that we need to worry about. We're not told to worry how we should eat, what shall we drink, what shall we wear, how shall we vote. All these things others may run about for, but we aren't to. All we have to do is seek God's kingdom and God's righteousness, and everything else that we need will be given to us as well. That's what we're told by Jesus. And if there's anyone who will uphold his promises, it's Jesus. And so how should we choose? How should we conduct ourselves? Well, we should clothe ourselves with Christ. And to borrow the words of one of God's servants, John Wesley, we should vote without fear or reward for the person that we judge most worthy. And judgment here is key. This isn't moral judgment or standing in judgment on these people. But we have to make an assessment. Ultimately, we have to come to a decision. And we must vote for whoever we judge to be most worthy. But that doesn't mean that we have license to speak against those we disagree with, or speak evil of those we vote against. And again, to speak evil of is very different from campaigning against. You might campaign against someone on the true and sincere conviction that they are the wrong person to govern this country, or that their record doesn't justify handing them such enormous power. To whom much is given, much is expected. And he who is faithful in small things shall be faithful in large, and he who is unfaithful with what little they have can't be trusted with larger things. We're told these things, and we're meant to keep them in mind. But to disagree, and to disagree honestly and sincerely, can still be done with speech that is full of grace and seasoned with salt. And we're to take care that our spirits aren't sharpened against those who voted for those we might disagree with. Polarization is such a strong word. It's a great word, really, very vivid. This idea that, we can be on other ends of an issue so entirely that it comes between us. But nonetheless, without agreeing with people, or rather without necessarily giving in to other people's opinions, we can disagree in a healthy way. And even if we disagree vehemently, even if we hold the strongest possible opinions, we're both children of God. It isn't that enough that we should care for each other and care for each other's welfare enough not to take up swords against each other or to become enemies of each other. Political engagement, as with our secular work, should be an act of worship. This idea of secular distinction between church and state is fine for politics. The authorities that are given to civic authorities, there are certain powers that, the Prime Minister might have. But inside us, inside our hearts, there should be no such distinction. All we do and all we are is for God. And so we should also beware here of chauvinism. We shouldn't just vote for those we think would be best for Christians. If there were a candidate who were pandering to Christians and saying, I'll treat you well at the expense of the country, that shouldn't be someone we should vote for, because we should do to others what we'd have them do to us. And that means thinking, should we vote according to our own best interests or according to everyone's best interests? Would we really promote a world where everyone votes just for their own best interests and doesn't consider the interests of others? In his letter to the Philippians, Paul writes that he loves Timothy and longs to send him to the Philippians because, unlike everyone else, he doesn't just look to his own interests, but has a genuine and sincere interest and investment in what matters and what's important to those around him. We should also beware of wolves in sheep clothing. It's very easy to say the right things. Politicians are generally great orators. They're great at speaking, great at presenting themselves as people who can and will do the very best thing in every situation. So much so that they can say things that are outright lies or direct contradictions of each other, and nonetheless woo us with the smoothness of their talk. But smooth talking may be, but it goes down like poison. And we should also love our neighbor and consider everyone else's interests, and we should hope and pray that every Christian should do so. We also shouldn't be easily bored. Don't be so easily bored as to think, well, this candidate takes care of my top two issues and that's enough for me. Study people's character as well as people's words. And we should fast and we should pray and we should research and we should plan. It's not just spiritual or just physical. In our very bodies, these two meet. And so in the world, we should be not surprised that these things meet. In the spirits and in the power of reason and hard work and energy that God has given to us. In the life we have in our mortal bodies, we should make sure that we do all we can to be good citizens here as everywhere. So if you're going to vote with your conscience, you really, really should make sure that your conscience is well informed. And also, be aware of complacency. The job isn't done when the votes are counted. And what came to mind here was thinking about the kings of the Old Testament. In the books of 1 and 2 Kings, we see a great deal of examples of the kings of Israel, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah after the rift left by Solomon's unwise son. And so many of these kings started well, but they finished poorly. So I put a few examples there: Solomon, Uzziah, Hezekiah, and Asa. And King Hezekiah made the mistake of not giving credit for all his glory to God. King Uzziah was a good king, one after God's heart, who took it upon himself, despite being warned by the high priest, to go and offer sacrifices himself. He brought his ego into his worship, and he was struck down with leprosy until the day he died. King Solomon started well, and indeed his wisdom is such that it's legendary even today. But he took on, well, I think something like 700 wives and 300 concubines, which is mathematically dizzying. But nonetheless, it meant that, with his heart split into so many pieces, his heart was no longer for God. And so in his old age, he is led away from what he knew to be right. And whether or not you vote for a certain officials, whoever wins in your constituency and as the country as a whole represents you. They're acting in your name, and they're acting on the authority of their mandate, which is of those who have voted for them true. But, by the very act of being in this country and being a citizen, their decisions both affect you and represent you in this country and abroad. But this also gives us certain rights and responsibilities. Remember, we are people under authority. And so make sure that as we're under authority, we make the most of the power that authority gives us. And our continuing response in everything, as Paul writes in Philippians, by prayer and petition, we should present our requests to God and make sure that we are wise as serpents and harmless as doves. So to finish off, some things to pray for. We should pray fundamentally for an election conducted in grace and truth, that we may see each other through Jesus' eyes, that political candidates, activists, and media players in the entire country should seek the guidance of God, that those standing for office should be strengthened and encouraged, because it's not easy, that candidates and all of us should have listening ears and soft hearts, that we and other candidates should address poverty and justice issues. Pray that our leaders would commit to working together, that we should have cross-party consensus, and that the cause of right should be a lot more engaging, that the cause of right should surpass and supersede in every situation political expediency or the pursuit of holding on to power. And we should pray that as people rise to office and people lose their office, God elects and removes people according to his own will and not to what we think would be best. And so as we go into this election season, I pray that you are indeed praying and that you're persistent in prayer and faithful in it, and that you may be wise and strengthened for this task that lies ahead of us. But also that in this, as with every other area of our lives, we should be transformed through our knowledge of Christ.